Story 1. The Stranger in the Hot Tub. In the sleepy college town of Bloomington, Indiana, where the days bled into one another with the monotony of lectures and late-night study sessions, Mark Thompson lived in a modest rental house on the edge of a dense, whispering forest. The woods, vibrant and inviting under the sun, transformed into a labyrinth of shadows as night fell, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. Mark, a junior majoring in psychology, was no stranger to the eerie ambiance, but he'd grown accustomed to it until the night of March 29, 2025, when the ordinary unraveled into something sinister. It was the tail end of spring break, and Mark had invited his three closest friends: Kyle, a boisterous engineering major; Keenan, the laid-back philosophy student; and Derek, the aspiring filmmaker with a penchant for the dramatic, to spend one last carefree night before the grind of classes resumed. The garage was their sanctuary, filled with the clatter of pool balls, the thump of bass-heavy music, and the clink of beer bottles. Laughter echoed off the concrete walls, a defiant stand against the looming responsibilities of the semester. As midnight crept closer, the air grew chilly, and Kyle, ever the instigator, suggested they move the party to the hot tub nestled beneath the back patio. The idea was met with enthusiastic agreement. The promise of warm, bubbling water was a siren call against the crisp March night. They changed into swim trunks, grabbed fresh drinks, and sank into the steaming tub, the heat seeping into their bones as they traded stories and jabs, oblivious to the passage of time. The first sign of trouble was subtle, a faint snap of twigs from the woods beyond the patio's glow. The sound was sharp, deliberate, not the skittering of a raccoon or the rustle of wind. The group fell silent, their eyes darting to the tree line. Keenan, always the voice of reason, chuckled nervously. "Probably just a deer, guys, chill." But the laughter that followed was forced, tinged with unease. They cranked the music louder, trying to drown out the creeping dread. 10 minutes later, the darkness parted, and a figure emerged into the patio's light. He was tall, gaunt, dressed in a long black coat that hung off his frame like a shroud. White sweatpants clung to his legs, and a gaming headset rested incongruously on his head, its mic glinting faintly. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his face was a mask of eerie calm, devoid of emotion. The group froze, their voices caught in their throats. "Who the hell are you?" Mark shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of fear and anger. The man raised his hands slowly, as if in surrender, and spoke in a flat, almost mechanical tone. "I'm Seth. I'm 33. I heard you laughing. I want to join." His words hung in the air, absurd yet chilling. The friends exchanged bewildered glances, their buzz evaporating into panic. "Get out of here, man!" Kyle barked, standing up in the hot tub, water streaming off him. But Seth didn't flinch. Instead, he began to undress with deliberate slowness, shedding his coat, then his shoes, and finally his pants, revealing a pair of worn boxers. Before anyone could react, he stepped into the hot tub, the water rippling around him as he settled in, uninvited among them. The air grew thick with tension. Mark fumbled for his phone, hitting record not out of curiosity, but out of a desperate need to document the surreal nightmare unfolding. "What do you want, Seth?" Derek asked, his voice trembling. Seth's gaze drifted over them, unseeing as he repeated, "I heard you laughing. I want to hang out." His words were a monotone chant, each syllable tightening the knot in their stomachs. Then, as if sensing their growing fear, Seth's expression shifted, a faint smirk curling his lips. "I've done things," he said softly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I hurt a kid once, a long time ago." The confession landed like a grenade, shattering the last vestiges of their composure. The group erupted, scrambling out of the tub, their shouts overlapping in a cacophony of panic. "Get out! Get the hell out!" Mark roared, grabbing Seth's arm and yanking him from the water. Seth didn't resist. He stood there, dripping, his eyes locked on them with an unnerving intensity. Without a word, he turned and shuffled back toward the woods, his silhouette swallowed by the darkness. The friends bolted inside, locking every door and window, their laughter replaced by shaky breaths and whispered arguments about what to do next. 15 minutes later, Kyle insisted they secure the hot tub. "We can't just leave it out there," he said, his voice tight. Mark nodded reluctantly, grabbing a flashlight. They stepped onto the patio, the beam cutting through the night. That's when Mark spotted it. A phone lying beside the hot tub, its screen glowing faintly. He picked it up, and the lock screen flickered to life. What he saw made his blood run cold. He dropped the phone, his hands trembling, refusing to describe the image that had seared itself into his mind. "We need to get back inside," he whispered, his voice barely audible. But before they could move, a soft tapping echoed from the living room window. Mark's heart sank. He didn't need to look to know who it was. He crept inside, peeled back the curtain, and there stood Seth, his pale face illuminated by the porch light. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and a grotesque smile stretched across his lips. Too wide, too wrong. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stared. "Kyle, call the cops!" Mark shouted, his voice breaking. Kyle fumbled for his phone, dialing 911 as Mark grabbed a baseball bat from the closet. He flung open the front door, bat raised, and screamed, "Take your damn phone and leave!" Seth didn't respond. Instead, he began to circle the house, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. Mark followed at a distance, peering through the patio window. Seth was there again, standing motionless, his gaze piercing through the glass. "The cops are coming!" Mark yelled, his voice raw. Seth raised a hand, gave a single mocking wave, and melted back into the woods. The police arrived minutes later, their flashlights sweeping the tree line. They found Seth standing alone in the forest, staring toward the house, his expression vacant. He was arrested for trespassing, and the group thought it was over. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there. Days later, a Snapchat story from a neighbor, a girl named Emily, sent a chill down his spine. The video showed a man, not Seth, lurking outside her window at 2 a.m., his face obscured by a hood. He didn't try to break in, just stood there, watching, before vanishing into the night. Mark's mind raced. Was Seth part of something bigger, a network of strangers haunting the edges of their town? The woods, once a backdrop to his quiet life, now felt like a gateway to something far darker, and Mark knew he'd never feel safe again. Story 2. The Tunnel Beneath the Creek. In the winter of 2022, the small town of Westfield, Indiana, was blanketed in snow, its streets quiet under the weight of a bitter cold that seeped into every home. For 3 high school juniors, Beck, Matthew, and Tyler, boredom was a constant enemy, and the promise of adventure was a siren call they couldn't resist. The trio had grown up exploring their neighborhood, but one place had always eluded them: a sewer tunnel beneath a frozen creek, hidden at the edge of town near a cluster of abandoned office buildings. Its gaping mouth had taunted them for years, a black void that whispered of secrets and danger. On a frigid January night, with the moon casting a pale glow over the snow, the boys made their decision. Armed with flashlights, sleds as a flimsy alibi, and the reckless courage of youth, they set out for the tunnel. "If anyone asks, we're just sledding," Tyler said, his breath clouding in the air. They parked near the office buildings, their headlights cutting through the darkness, only to be interrupted by the sudden flash of police lights. An officer approached, his face stern. "What are you kids doing out here?" he asked, eyeing their sled skeptically. "Just sledding, sir," Tyler lied, his voice steady. The officer stared for a long moment before waving them off. "Get out of here. This isn't a playground." They drove away, hearts pounding, but their resolve only grew stronger. 30 minutes later, they returned, parking behind a dilapidated building where no cameras could see. They trudged through the snow, their sleds dragging behind them until they reached the tunnel's entrance. It loomed before them, a concrete maw wide enough to swallow a car, its interior pitch black and silent save for the faint drip of water echoing from within. Beck flicked on his flashlight, the beam trembling as it pierced the darkness. "Let's do this," he said, his voice betraying a mix of excitement and dread. They stepped inside, the air growing colder with every step, their breaths visible in the dim light. The walls were a canvas of faded graffiti, tags and symbols scrawled in layers of peeling paint. But one mark stood out. A date, 6/19/19, sprayed in bold red letters, the paint still glossy, as if applied mere days ago. That's recent, Matthew whispered, his voice barely audible. The discovery sent a shiver through them, but they pressed on, their bravado masking the fear gnawing at their edges. The tunnel stretched deeper than they'd expected, its walls slick with condensation, the air heavy with the scent of damp concrete. Icicles hung from the ceiling, some as thick as a man's arm, their tips glinting like daggers. The boys' flashlights flickered, their beams struggling to penetrate the oppressive darkness. "This place is a freaking ice cave," Tyler muttered, his voice echoing off the walls. They laughed, but it was hollow, a feeble attempt to keep the fear at bay. Then they saw it, a faint glow, far down the tunnel, like the flicker of a distant campfire. "Is that a light?" Beck asked, squinting into the void. The group froze, their breaths held as the glow seemed to pulse, almost alive. "Maybe it's just a reflection," Matthew offered, but his voice lacked conviction. They took a cautious step forward, then another, drawn by curiosity and the need to prove they weren't scared. That's when the sound came, a low guttural crack, like stone splitting under immense pressure. It reverberated through the tunnel, shaking the ground beneath their feet. "Run!" Tyler shouted, and they didn't hesitate. They sprinted toward the entrance, their flashlights bouncing wildly, casting chaotic shadows on the walls. Beck tripped, his phone slipping from his pocket and clattering to the ground. But he didn't stop. They burst out into the snowy night, gasping for air, their faces pale with terror. "What the hell was that?" Matthew panted, his hands on his knees. Beck's face fell as he realized his phone was gone. "I dropped it back there," he said, his voice small. "Forget it, man," Tyler snapped. "We're not going back." But Beck was already moving, his flashlight in hand, determination overriding his fear. "I need it," he said, and before they could stop him, he was heading back into the tunnel. Matthew and Tyler exchanged a look, then followed, their reluctance palpable. The tunnel felt different now, the air thicker, the silence more oppressive. Their flashlights seemed dimmer, the batteries draining faster than they should have. They found Beck's phone near where he'd fallen, its screen cracked but intact. "Got it," he whispered, relief flooding his voice. But as they turned to leave, another sound stopped them cold. A scream, unlike anything they'd ever heard. It was neither human nor animal, a discordant wail that seemed to come from multiple throats, low and high, blending into a cacophony that clawed at their sanity. It echoed closer, growing louder, as if whatever made it was moving toward them. They ran again, faster this time, their fear a living thing driving them forward. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, the entrance impossibly far. When they finally stumbled out, the cold air hit them like a slap, but they didn't stop until they reached the car. They piled in, tires screeching as they sped away, the tunnel's darkness shrinking in the rearview mirror. The drive home was silent, each boy lost in their own thoughts, the weight of what they'd experienced settling over them like a shroud. That night, Beck's doorbell rang at 3 a.m. His father, groggy and annoyed, answered, but no Yixi was there. The same thing happened the next night and the night after that. Beck couldn't shake the feeling that they'd brought something back with them, something that had followed them from the tunnel. The video they'd recorded, shaky footage of the graffiti, the icicles, and the fleeting glow, became their only proof, but it wasn't enough to quiet the questions that haunted them. What was in that tunnel, and why did it feel like it wasn't done with them? Story 3. The Ritual in the Woods. In the spring of 2022, Connor Ryan, a 28-year-old construction worker with a penchant for solitude, took a 3-month job in the rural heart of Kentucky. The gig promised decent pay and a chance to escape the financial strain that had dogged him for years. His friend Jim, a fellow worker with a quick laugh and a shared love for the outdoors, made the prospect even more appealing. They envisioned long days of hard work followed by quiet evenings under the stars, far from the noise of their usual lives. The job site was nestled in a forgotten corner of the state, where rolling hills gave way to dense, ancient forests. The nearest town was a 30-minute drive down winding, unmarked roads, and the only signs of life were the occasional deer or the distant bark of a dog. Connor relished the isolation, seeing it as a chance to reconnect with himself. While his coworkers spent their weekends at the local dive bar, he planned a solo camping trip, craving the silence of the wilderness. On a crisp Friday evening, Connor packed his gear, tent, sleeping bag, a small hatchet, and enough food for 2 days, and set out for a trailhead just 5 minutes from the crew's temporary housing. The forest welcomed him with open arms, its canopy filtering the fading sunlight into a mosaic of golden green. He hiked deeper, the crunch of leaves under his boots, and the whistle of the wind his only companions. A joint or two helped ease the tension in his shoulders, the world softening around the edges as he lost himself in the rhythm of the trail. As dusk settled, the forest grew quieter, the air heavier. Connor decided to find a spot to camp, his eyes scanning for a clearing. That's when he noticed it, a faint, acrid smell, like burning wood, carried on the breeze. A thin veil of smoke curled through the trees, and in the distance, a soft orange glow flickered, barely visible through the underbrush. Curiosity tugged at him. Another camper, perhaps? Or locals having a bonfire? He left the trail, moving cautiously toward the light, his combat training from his teenage years giving him a false sense of invincibility. The scene that greeted him was anything but ordinary. Dozens of shopping carts, their metal frames rusted and twisted, were tied to trees with thick ropes, some suspended in grotesque, unnatural angles, swaying gently in the breeze. It was as if the forest itself had been transformed into a nightmarish sculpture garden. Each cart a silent sentinel in a ritual Connor couldn't comprehend. The fire at the center roared, its flames licking at the sky, and above it hung a charred antique duck ornament, its paint blistered and peeling. Perched on its back was a baby doll, its plastic face melted into a grotesque parody of a smile, its limbs warped by the heat. Connor's stomach churned, but he couldn't look away. He pulled out his phone, snapping photos, the flash illuminating the eerie tableau. The fire was fresh, tended recently, and scattered around it were empty water bottles, their labels pristine, as if left only hours ago. Someone had been here. Maybe still was. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. Just some weird hermit, he muttered, trying to convince himself. But the longer he stood there, the more the forest seemed to close in, the shadows lengthening, the silence growing oppressive. He turned to leave, his boots crunching louder than he liked, when a new sound stopped him, a low, mournful whistle, drifting through the trees. It was a tune he didn't recognize, slow and deliberate, each note hanging in the air like a warning. His blood ran cold. The whistling grew closer, accompanied by the faint snap of twigs, as if someone or something was circling him. Connor's training kicked in, and he bolted, crashing through the underbrush, his breath ragged. He didn't stop until he was far from the site, his lungs burning, his mind racing. By 9 p.m., he'd set up camp a mile away, his tent pitched in a small clearing, a modest fire crackling before it. He cooked a simple meal, the routine grounding him, and smoked another joint to dull the edge of his fear. A true crime podcast played through his earbuds, the narrator's voice recounting a decades-old murder case, the words blending with the forest's ambient hum. For a moment he felt safe, cocooned in the glow of his fire, but safety was an illusion. At 4 a.m., Connor jolted awake, the air inside his tent icy, the fire reduced to glowing embers. He fumbled for his phone, the screen reading 4:02. The forest was silent, too silent, until the whistling returned, closer this time, its melody twisting through the trees like a living thing. Then came the footsteps, light, rapid, circling his tent, the crunch of leaves and twigs unmistakable. His body froze, every instinct screaming to stay still, to become invisible. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment he dared to hope. Then they resumed, faster, more erratic, as if multiple people were darting around him, their movements uncoordinated but relentless. Panic seized him, and he acted on instinct, ripping open the tent and sprinting into the night, his boots barely laced. The footsteps followed, a chaotic symphony of pursuit, some from behind, others from the sides, as if the forest itself had turned against him. He ran for what felt like hours, branches tearing at his skin, his lungs screaming for air. Finally, he dove into a thicket, burying himself in leaves and roots, his body pressed against the earth. The footsteps slowed, then faded, But he didn't move, didn't breathe until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. He crawled out, his body bruised and bleeding, and made his way back to the trailhead, his heart pounding with every step. Back at the accommodation, Connor reported the incident to the police, showing them the photos of the ritual site. They took his statement, their faces skeptical, and promised to investigate. He never heard from them again. The job ended, and he returned home. But the memory of that night clung to him like a shadow. The whistling, the footsteps, the twisted shrine. It wasn't just a random encounter. It felt like he'd stumbled into something ancient, something that didn't want to be found. And deep down, Connor knew he'd been lucky to escape with his life.